So I'm Bryce Chappelle, and my group did a presentation on the ANC, the African National Congress. My group is Mia, Jesus, Macario, Rosario, and Lily. Okay, so the ANC. So between 1948 and 1964, this party was a dominant force in African nationalist opposition to the apartheid system. I think a big thing about it is it was a party that really represented the majority of Africans in the area. They knew that they needed something to represent them and to represent what they believe. The black workers, the middle class workers, they were an important part of the organization. They made up most of the organization. And an increase in industrial manufacturers invited more African workers to the economy after World War II. Oh, and by the way, it was the period of the ANC was between 1948 and 1964. Okay. So the leaders were Oliver Tambo, Albert Luthuli, and Nelson Mandela. And of course, they were arrested in 1964. So that's why the ANC kind of fell apart, but I'll get to that later. There's not really a good place to put it on my face. Alright, so the purpose of the ANC leaders were to strategize ways to bring equality to the South African people. They were there to represent them. They were there to help to negotiate with the government at first. You know, that was their thing, their thing of nonviolence to bring about ways of change for their people. And one impact they had was that they promoted the welfare of Africans, and they just wanted change for their people. Okay, so their campaign. So one of them was the Defiance Campaign. It was just large protests, peaceful protests against the government. It was the first step into the political eye, expressing the voices of the South African people. And then there was the campaign against the Bantu Education Act. I think basically the main problem was their schools were terrible and they weren't learning everything that they felt that they could have. There were their resources, they didn't have access to a lot of resources, and their schools were often overpopulated and they didn't have the things that they needed to really succeed. So the treason trials took place between 1956 and 1961. It was covering a picture. 156 people were on trial, including Nelson Mandela. So, I mean, the good thing was the defendants were found not guilty, but it resulted in the ANC started, to fall apart because all their leaders were arrested. But it was important because it persuaded the new leaders of the ANC, which the government was determined to increase repression. And then the Sharpeville Massacre happened, of course, in 1960. Nearly 70 South African protesters were killed. And that's what really started to make people angry. And basically I was going to say that this led to the ANC falling apart and then it breaking away, and then the PAC was formed, but that's another topic, So the pros and cons of the ANC. So created a youth league, Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter was huge because for once, it appealed to really all Africans. So one of the big problems for the ANC was it didn't truly create a campaign against the apartheid. I mean, it wasn't a true movement, and it didn't really appeal so much to the poor Africans. It really appealed mostly to the middle class Africans. So that was a bad thing about it. But the Freedom Charter really appealed to everyone. So that was a big thing about that. It had moral high ground. It became more radical, of course, especially after Sharpeville. They were like, well, the government doesn't really want to negotiate peacefully. They don't speak our language, so it's time to start stepping it up. Successful Defiance campaign, but it was too conservative, too traditional. And like I said, the poor didn't really feel represented by the AMC too much. Middle class, blah, blah. And they tried to create like alternative schools, but they didn't have the resources necessary to do that. So that was one of their failures as well. Anything else? I think that's it. I think that's it.